I am actually a resident and a native of Middleton. So it's great fun for me to be able to talk to the Middleton Chamber of Commerce. I want to talk today about the role of the university in economic growth, but I really want to start with what I call the Minnesota Conundrum. Minnesota is a state that in many ways is a lot like Wisconsin. It has sort of a similar economic and cultural legacy, similar geography, and of course, similar climate. And yet there's noticeable economic differences between the two states. There's a big gap in the gross domestic product per capita, as well as the personal income. And similarly, Minnesota has outpaced Wisconsin in job growth. And so there's this question about why this is. And a lot of people want to attribute this to politics. They want to say that some preferred policy regime in one state, Minnesota in this case, is causing Minnesota to grow faster. And although that hypothesis appeals to a lot of people, when you actually look at the long-term trend, this is what it looks like. Wisconsin is in green here and Minnesota's in the background in purple. This is from the 60s.
Aaron, I don't think we're seeing the same slide that you're on. So it just says,
I'm sorry, what are you seeing?
It just says it's like your title slide. So it says the role of the university. There we go.
All right. Well, let me skip back then. So here's the gap in GDP per capita. I'll see if I can make the sorter here smaller. Is that better?
Yep, you're good.
Here's the job growth. I was not reading you all my numbers here. Here's a bunch of headlines that claim that Minnesota is growing faster because they have better governors than we do. But here's the long-term trend. This is from the 1960s through the 1990s, although if you continue it, it keeps going. And you can kind of see that, Wisconsin, in the early part of this graph is kind of keeping up with Minnesota, but right about in here, Minnesota clearly takes off right in the mid 1970s. At that point or so, it just continued to pull away from us. Here's personal income over time. This is going through 2017. And you can kind of see the same thing. We're kind of competing. And right about here in the mid 1970s, Minnesota just takes off and starts diverging from Wisconsin. And so the question is, why is this the case? What's causing this? And I'll give you one wrong answer. It's not because of the University of Minnesota. That would not be a good ending to this story. There's something else at play. So I'm going to leave you with this question to think about, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the university and what universities contribute to economic growth. I feel fortunate. I have gone to a number of very esteemed educational institutions, the most important being Middleton High School, which I graduated from some time ago now. I also graduated from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, but I was also lucky enough to attend this place, which was Oxford University, and to graduate there. And Oxford is not the oldest university in the world. That honor goes to the University of Bologna, but it's the oldest in the English-speaking world, and it's still unlike Bologna, it's still one of the top universities in the world. And it's actually a confederation of colleges. So All Souls College is in this picture on the right. That dome in the middle is actually a library called the Radcliffe Camera. And on the left is my college, Bresnes College. And one thing that you'll notice about this is that it looks a little bit like castles to me. There's gatehouses and courtyards, and everything is kind of walled in. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. A picture of a Oxford tradition and a requirement that's called subfusc. And it took me, I have to say, more than one try to learn to pronounce that in a way that wouldn't cause me to blush. But students are required to wear this uniform for matriculation and while they're taking their exams and other certain functions. And there's a couple of things I want you to notice about it. One thing is that the students are all clutching mortarboard caps. So you're required to have this cap, but unless you're a high official, you're not allowed to wear it indoors. All the students carry the caps around, but they're not allowed to wear them by tradition. The other thing is, notice how they're all wearing gowns. It's hard to see because the subfusc is all black and white, but over their suits or over their skirts and thrown over their shoulders, they have these partial gowns, black gowns of various lengths, which are also required not only when you're wearing subfusc, but also if you want to go to dinner at your college when the high table is seated, you're required to wear the gown. And so the phrase town and gown comes from Oxford. It comes from this tradition. Back in the day, the colleges were basically medieval halls where students held minor clerical statuses. And so they wore these gowns that were not dissimilar from what clergy would wear. And they were easily recognizable by the town folks. And so it came to be known as town and gown. And here, you know, we often talk about some of the tensions or relationships between town and gown, but back in the day, this was no joke. I mean, the arguments between town and gown would make our discussions about tuition freezes or critical race theory look like ping pong. The most famous conflict occurred on St. Scholastica Day. There were two students who were upset with the quality of their wine, and they threw it into a tavern keeper's face at Oxford, and this touched off a 3-day riot. The university chancellor went out and tried to settle the riot, but was shot at with arrows and had to retreat. So this lasted for 3 days. Somewhere, we don't know exactly how many, but somewhere between 50 and 100 people were killed during the riot. And ultimately, when the king came in and settled this, what he wound up doing is he wound up giving the university a lot of power over the commerce of the town. So they got assigned the power to tax bread and drink, to set weights and measures, and basically regulate commerce in the town of Oxford. In 1209, there was a student that accidentally or perhaps intentionally killed a woman. And when he realized what he had done, he fled. But the town caught up with his 3 flatmates and wound up hanging them in the streets of Oxford. And so the whole university kind of cleared out, and a lot of them wound up setting camp up in Cambridge in the 13th century and established Cambridge University, which we call the other place at Oxford. There's a very fierce rivalry between Oxford and Cambridge, and I'll give you my favorite example of this rivalry. The equivalent of a varsity letter at Oxford is called the Oxford Blue. And if you want to earn an Oxford Blue, you might think you have to become national champion or something like that, but you don't. You can become national champion, and it has really no bearing on whether or not you get your Oxford Blue. What you have to do to get the Oxford Blue is beat Cambridge in the varsity match. Town and gown was a pretty serious conflict. Now, this is a view from inside my college. So you're standing in the main courtyard looking out at that domed library just outside of it. And you'll notice there's only one way into the college. It's through this little tower. There's a place called a porter's lounge through there. Some people think that Bresnes College is a corruption of an old Latin word for brewery. And the way some of my peers drank back then, I think that that's possible. But most people think it was named after the knocker on the right hand. Most people think it was named after this brass knocker. This knocker was stolen in the 14th century from the college's predecessor, Bresnes Hall. And in 1890, the college purchased an entire house just to get that knocker back. And instead of putting it back on the front door, they hung it in the dining hall where it couldn't be stolen again. But if you were a student wearing your gown easily recognizable by the townspeople, and you were in trouble, you could flee through the streets of Oxford, bang on the college door, even late at night, and hopefully somebody would let you in and you'd slam the door behind you and retreat into the walls of the college where you were safe from the townie. Inside the college, there's a dining hall, there's bars, there's a chapel, there's a library. So there's really everything you need to live, back through time. And so by bringing students together in these cloistered environments, safe from the rapscallions outside the walls, this created kind of a great environment for preserving and transmitting knowledge. You could really have a lot of time when you never left the walls of the college or only at your own peril to exchange knowledge and ideas. But what the university wasn't really good at yet was change. This is a watercolor that was done of the same quad about 200 years before the picture that I just showed you. It hangs in the Ashmolean Museum. So Oxford loves tradition, but they hate change. In fact, there was a joke that used to circulate when I was there that went like this: how many Oxford Dons does it take to change a light bulb? And the punchline was change. That was a joke, but in the cloistered and controlling environment, you could protect knowledge, but you could preserve tradition. Here's another little Oxford tradition. This is me on the day that I graduated, or the day that I finished taking my exams at Oxford. It's traditional to wear a red carnation. Somebody will give you a red carnation on the last day of your exams. It's traditional for students to bring you champagne when you finish your exams. And it's also traditional for your friends to shower you with things. So if you have nice friends like me, you see the pink streamer kind of hanging off my coat, you might get showered with streamers. But if you have more boisterous friends, you might not be quite so lucky. This is other students leaving their exams. When you graduate from Oxford, there's a ceremony, and it takes place in Latin. It's been the same way for literally hundreds of years. And in fact, there's this one moment in the ceremony when the proctors sweep up and down the aisles in front of the dons that are assembled there. And they're not doing anything. There's no point to this. But because hundreds of years ago, they used to go around and collect ballots from the dons to determine whether or not you were going to be conferred a degree, they have kept this moment in the ceremony, even though it no longer serves a point. But they've been able to preserve this knowledge and this tradition. And so for many years, for hundreds and hundreds of years, universities were great at cloistering people together, transmitting knowledge, preserving their traditions, and passing it on generation after generation. But you can tell they had nothing to do with innovation. Well, this got transmitted to America, of course, and here's a variety of American university equivalents of the quad back in Oxford. Harvard's there on the top. Cornell is down in that lower left-hand corner. The tower in the center bottom there is the University of Michigan's law school. And it always strikes me when I look at that, how much it looks like some of the gatehouses going into colleges at Oxford. And of course, Bascom Hill is kind of built around this idea here in Madison. So we adopted a lot of the traditions and even the architecture of the European universities, and particularly Oxford and Cambridge. And we've developed our own traditions, whether it's the singing of varsity or rubbing Abe's foot on Bascom Hill before your exams, or stealing trays from the dorm cafeterias to go sledding when there's a good snowfall. We interpreted it a little differently. We no longer wall in our quads fully, but we imported a lot of this idea to America. And in much the same way, we didn't assign our universities an innovation mission until the 19th century. In 1862, a couple of interesting things happened. First of all, Wisconsin back then was a huge wheat producing state. We were well on our way to being known as America's wheatland instead of America's dairyland. We were the second biggest wheat producer in the country. And between 1840 and 1880, the state of Wisconsin grew 1/6 of the nation's wheat. But the problem was that the wheat was depleting the soil. And so there was a guy named William Dempster Hord who had founded a national magazine called Hord's Dairyman. He later became governor of Wisconsin. He was trying to convince people that they should change from wheat to dairy. And he had some luck, but he met resistance because growing crops was viewed as a very manly endeavor, whereas taking care of cows was viewed as women's work. So he ran into a lot of gender stereotypes in his battle to bring dairy to Wisconsin. But a couple things helped him in this fight. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln did two things. He signed the Morrill Land Grant Act, which sold land in order to fund universities in each state, including the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he also created the United States Department of Agriculture, which started supporting research and then creating networks to disseminate knowledge about agricultural innovation and technology. Now, I think I should pause here to acknowledge that the land that supported the Morrill Land Grant Act was, for the most part, acquired from Native Americans by either treaty or, in many cases, by force or by violence. And it's a history that universities are only now really beginning to fully acknowledge and understand and grapple with the legacy of that. But these two things started to create infrastructure, both in Wisconsin and elsewhere, to develop and disseminate knowledge about agriculture. And Wisconsin, and in particular in the early days in the College of, what's now the College of Agriculture and Life Science, did a lot to advance knowledge in this area. In 1890, a guy named Stephan Babcock set out to solve a problem. Milk back then was bought by the weight, but it was hard to tell when people were watering down the milk and giving you kind of low quality milk that didn't make very good butter or products that required a high butter fat content like cheese. And so cheese was the word I was looking for. So he was trying to find a simple way that you could test the butterfat content in milk. And he invented that little test you see those two boys playing with, which was partially chemical and partially mechanical, in order to measure the butterfat content in milk. And he made this test. He decided not to patent the test, and he made it widely available. It was very cheap. It got widely adopted, and it really helped the dairy industry because it encouraged them to up the quality levels. And it also then helped the proliferation of cheese plants in Wisconsin that could now assure themselves they were buying high quality milk that was worth the price they were paying to the farmers. But he came to regret the decision not to patent the technology over time. There were a lot of unscrupulous people back then who would make these wild claims about the butterfat content, and people began to doubt the veracity of the test. And of course, like all good innovations, other people improved upon it. So eventually somebody created a version for ice cream, which allowed you to make the richest, creamiest, fattest ice cream possible. And today, of course, Babcock ice cream, which is made down on campus and sold in various locations, but my favorite is at the Memorial Union Terrace, is arguably the best ice cream in town, named after Stephan Babcock and his test. Well, a few years later, a guy named Harry Steenbach came along, and he decided not to repeat the mistakes that Babcock did. He, in 1923, discovered that exposing food, and particularly milk, to ultraviolet light increased the vitamin D content in the foodstuff. And this discovery helped eliminate a disease called rickets, which is basically like weak bones, which is still not uncommon in the world, but has been largely eradicated by the 1940s thanks to this invention. He was offered a pretty big license by Quaker Oats for his invention, and he could have put it in his pocket and retired a rich man. But he thought it should go back to the university. So he got together with 8 of his friends. They each threw in $100, and they patented his technology, and they created the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation in 1925. And that invention was the first patent that Wharf acquired. They did the deal with Quaker Oats. They got the money from Quaker Oats, and they have grown that initial investment over time to what is today more than a $3 billion endowment that supports research at the University of Wisconsin. Here's a chart to kind of bring us back to the tie-in with the economy. This is research and development spending in the United States. And I think there's a couple of things to notice here. First of all, research and development spending really takes off right in the mid-1970s. You can see it kind of shoots up during the early years of the space race, and then it kind of levels off for a while. And then in the 1970s, it just starts growing and growing and growing, just like Minnesota's economy. The other thing that I think is interesting about this is federal research dominated this chart until 1980. And then after that, the private sector really took off. In 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act was passed, and that solved kind of a problem that the federal government was having in a great way. The federal government funded a lot of research, and they wound up generating all of this intellectual property that sat on shelves because it turned out the federal government was terrible at licensing it or figuring out what to do with it. So in 1980, they passed the Bayh-Dole Act, and they decided to let universities and small businesses that had developed intellectual property with federal money keep the patents and the rights to that technology. And then they created, in that way, an incentive for universities to go out and monetize the intellectual property, which is exactly what has happened over the years. So many universities, although they had some early forays, often in agricultural knowledge, didn't really get into the intellectual property game in gusto until 1980. But thanks to the efforts of Harry Steenbach and his friends that founded Wharf, Wisconsin had a 55-year head start over other universities. So let's go back to the Minnesota Conundrum. Has anyone guessed the answer to this yet? The answer to the mayor.
I would imagine that they are going out there and their research is more readily available to use, has more innovation, more companies, some of those.
I think that's exactly right. The innovation economy really took off in the 1970s. Before that, you had agriculture, which of course required vast fields, so that was spread around the country. You had a natural resource economy that was spread out according to where the forests or the mining deposits were. And you had an industrial economy, and that was kind of spread out based on where the population centers were, where the rail lines were, where harbors and ports and so forth were. But in the 1970s, Apple Computer was founded and Genentech, two of the early technology companies. And here in Dane County, we weren't far behind. Our sort of seminal software company, Epic, was founded in 1979. And our first life science giant, Promega, was founded in 1978. And this innovation economy is different than these previous sectors because it has a peculiar relationship with geography. When you scale up a city, a lot of things scale in a totally linear way. So if you double the size of Middleton, you have to double the number of housing units, roughly. There's infrastructure, though, that you don't necessarily have to double. You might be able to use your parks or your parade grounds or your miles of fiber that Jim has laid, or your, I don't know if you have fiber, I guess you, anyway. You can use your fiber, your gas stations with diminishing returns. You don't need to scale those as much. You can just use the infrastructure more intensively. But innovation and economic output scale with an increasing return, which is something that, as somebody with an economics background, I find fascinating because you don't see increasing returns very often. And let me show you kind of what that means. If scale didn't matter, then the number of patents that were generated per capita would kind of look like this. If you divided the cities of the country into quartiles and looked at them, you would kind of expect that innovation is just randomly distributed. People are thinking up great ideas all over the place, and it really doesn't matter whether you're in, a small community in Iowa or in, Dallas. The likelihood of you generating an idea that's patentable is kind of roughly equal. But this isn't actually what it looks like at all. It actually looks like this. The bigger the city gets, the more it grows on almost every economic output, particularly those related to innovation. So here's math and computer science occupations per 1,000 people. What you kind of see from this is that the largest metros in the country on average are 20 times bigger than the smallest metros. But on this measure, and on most measures, they're between 40 and 50 times stronger on almost any measure related to innovation or economic output. There's something about clustering people up that helps make knowledge and innovation advance. And so the answer to this conundrum, I don't know that this has been proven, but I think my very strong hypothesis is that Wisconsin has got a population that's distributed all over the place in small communities that popped up around these old dairy communities and farming communities. And our biggest population center is only a quarter of the state. Here in Dane County, we have about, in this area, broadly speaking, we have a little over 10% of the state. But in Minnesota, they have 2/3 of their population clustered into the Twin Cities metro area. And so because innovation scales with increasing returns, they have outpaced us ever since the innovation economy took over from the industrial economy. So it's kind of interesting, we're talking a lot these days about the return to the office and what happens with COVID. But what's been going on for a long time is, although we have the technology to be remote, we could all spread out all over the state or all over the country if we wanted to. Increasingly, the world lives in urban areas. We are increasingly concentrating our economy around innovation-related growth sectors by moving into cities. And I don't really see that ending. Here's what I learned during COVID. This is the University Research Park office west here on the left-hand side of the picture. This is what my office looked like during COVID. You can see my pretty coworker there in the background. It was a great place for me to put my head down and make PowerPoint slides or get into spreadsheets or write things, but it wasn't a very good place for collaboration. Kristen and I were talking beforehand about how hard it was to just make a quick phone call to a colleague and miss them and play phone tag, and you couldn't just have a 30-second spontaneous interaction. The Madison Google office is on the right. You can see it's kind of the opposite of my house. You can just stand up and talk over your partition at the guy sitting behind you. They also have great donuts there. So there's these moments where you can just go out into the common area and get a donut and run into somebody and give them an idea that sparks a thought. And the next thing you know, you've got a new Google product. So I think the death of the office is greatly exaggerated because I think this power of clustering people together to produce knowledge happens at every level of scale. We see it at the city level, but I think it happens at other levels of scale. I think it turns out that universities do this. Universities could spread out all over the world. There's no real reason you have to have your research lab in Madison. or on a campus that has no parking, why not put it in Rhinelander or in Bayfield? I think the biggest reason not to do that is that the ability to be working on a problem and walk across the hall, tell it to 3 colleagues and have them give you 15 ideas on the fly is part of what makes innovation happen. And it's one of the reasons why cities have such a benefit over smaller communities. There's more people clustered, having more interactions with greater density, greater frequency. There's more spillovers of knowledge occurring, and it fundamentally drives innovation at every level. And so here's a little chart to kind of bring this home. This is city population on the bottom axis of mid-sized cities between 400,000 people and 1 million people. And this is how many patents they've produced over about 10 years on the y-axis. And there's a regression line that's dropped through there. And you can see where I've put Madison here. This is what Madison would look like, except for I left out one important player. And you can kind of see we'd be hanging out. The people in that circle are people like Toledo or Albany or Boise, Idaho. But it turns out we have a secret weapon. The University of Wisconsin-Madison, which I left off that chart. I included all of the patents from spinouts of the university, my tenants at the research park, but I left off the university itself, which is one of the top research universities in the country. And although people appreciate this, I don't think they appreciate how much stronger it is than a lot of places we really respect. It does more research than Harvard, than MIT, than Stanford, and of course, more than the University of Minnesota. So when you throw in the patents produced by the University of Wisconsin, here's where we actually are. We're one of the outliers way off the regression line. We punch way above our weight class, and we're hanging around with people like Durham, which is actually, if you combine with Raleigh, a much, much bigger, a 2 million person metro area, but we're right up there with them in terms of innovation. We're hanging out with the suburbs of LA and Boston and trailing some of the suburbs of New York a little bit. So the university is helping us, although we have a relatively small population, we're doing much, much better than most cities our size because we're able to take the knowledge created at the university and translate it in a big way, not only to patents, but ultimately into companies. Here's my favorite example of that. This is Lynn Allen Hoffman. And I think it's a great story, the discovery of Stratatec. Lynn was not somebody who wanted to be an entrepreneur or to launch a company. She was a researcher. She liked doing research. She was happy in her lab publishing papers. But one day she was growing skin in Petri dishes, and it was supposed to develop abnormalities in dye. And this one dish just wouldn't die. This skin line just lived and lived and lived. And so she started studying it. And eventually she found out that this property could be quite useful, perhaps first in treating burn victims so that they wouldn't have to autograft the victim's skin from other places on the body or use cadaver skin. They could grow skin in Petri dishes and put that on people that suffered from wounds or burns. And so she launched Stratatec. And today they have just got FDA approval after 20 years of work to commercialize this technology. They have 2 facilities in Research Park, and they are beginning to ship this product all over the country to revolutionize the way burns are treated. And this kind of innovation is what is today powering Dane County's economy. This is a cluster graph chart I just produced just for this talk. I just updated it with the latest information. And what you're looking at here are all of the clusters that generate money by exporting services to other places. So we're ignoring restaurants and retail stores that kind of circulate money within a community. We're looking at the things that import wealth to Dane County. And each cluster gets its own little bubble. The size of the bubble is roughly corresponding to how many people work in that cluster. And its position on the y-axis is measuring its location quotient. So in other words, how distinctive is Dane County? So something with a 1 means that we are average distinctiveness in the country. something with a 3 means we have 3 times more people in that cluster than you would expect us to based on our population. And you can see that for life sciences and software, we're up at more of a 4 or 5, which is really high for a location quotient. And then on the y-axis, you have job growth. And so when I look at this, what I see is a couple things. One, life sciences and software IT are really the 2 clusters that are big, that have a lot of people working in them, that are growing rapidly in terms of jobs, and that we have a distinctive advantage in. Medical lab equipment is not far behind. And then we have a lot of things that frankly are very important, but aren't growing very quickly, like insurance or business services. The green is mostly manufacturing related, and you can see most of those are actually shrinking. So more and more, it's these innovation things that like to cluster that come out of the university that are driving Dane County's economy. And increasingly, Dane County is driving Wisconsin's economy. The blue lines here are how many jobs you would expect Dane County to create based on our population. If we were kind of creating our fair share of jobs or losing our fair share. And the orange is what has actually happened over the last 10 years or so. And what you can see is that in almost every year, Dane County is producing a disproportionate number of Wisconsin's jobs. So I think that this clustering idea is very powerful. I've built a whole strategy around it for University Research Park. We were, and still are, a classic suburban style office park. You can see there's a lot of green space, a lot of lawns, and a lot of surface parking lots. But increasingly, we're trying to cluster people up and densify the park and make it more amenity rich. Our first catalytic project was this building, a corporate headquarters that we built for Exact Sciences. And today we're working on this little development that's in the foreground up on Mineral Point Road. If you come out here today, you'll see the bulldozers working to prepare the sites for these projects. But we are working on a new project to bring what we call a little mini town center, a lab building, restaurants, coffee shops, fitness facilities, a hotel, and apartments to the research park to create a more modern innovation district that promotes the kind of collaboration that will lead to ideas. So the university took hundreds of years to get into the innovation game. But today, thanks to people that had the foresight to start WRF and to invest in innovation here, Madison is helping punch way above our weight class already. And we have a huge opportunity to capitalize on the university by clustering people together, generating knowledge, and accelerate these growing clusters in our economy. So that's the importance of the university. I hope you'll join us in protecting and promoting it. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Aaron, this is simply outstanding.
Thank you, Mayor.
I wish that there were 1,000 people here listening to you rather than just the select group of people who are here, which is great. So I'm very, very impressed. And, I'm just wondering if we could spread some of this charm to Middleton as well, as you know. And I also want to say thank you for, we were at Oxford University there. Our son was at Cambridge. And so we mainly just walked down there, but we didn't know the history, which we missed part of it, which you showed us here. And I also didn't know how the Cambridge came about. Now I do. I know they're very competitive and very different.
Just remember they were second.
But me,
just remember they were second.
I know they were thinking differently when you look at the Nobel Prizes now. I don't know which one has more now, but in any case, I think the Cambridge isn't doing all that bad. So it's pretty good. So, but I could also see the way teaching happens there versus here. And it's good you went to Oxford, and boy, and we are lucky that you're here. So I know we had meetings once, and I still would want to meet with you again, that how could we have more of these technology companies coming to Middleton. I have tried very hard to start those innovation centers and discovery center. Finally, it's happening. Hopefully it's happening in Middleton High School. I'm going to make sure that it does happen. But we need some, some magic dust to start some MD&E incubator here. And it's just so hard to do it. If somehow you could help out with that, boy, that would be so wonderful.
I have to admit, I daydream about working with the city of Middleton quite often. Some of the cities I work with are not as easy to work with.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
Aaron, we did have a question come in through chat too. So what was the catalyst to move from office/labs to mixed use?
Yeah, I saw that. And I could give a whole talk about this, but in a nutshell, this is the idea that when you cluster people up and you give them ways of interacting, you get more innovation out. So we are going to mixed use for really two reasons. One, we know our tenants want it. They are trying to attract talent, and they need things like restaurants, coffee shops, gyms, daycare, apartments, hotels around them, entertainment, so they can have a more dynamic environment than just an office park in order to recruit the kind of talent they want. But we also think that by making our park more campus-like and encouraging interactions, we don't have to, try to convince people that they should schedule meetings with each other or play matchmaker. We can just give them coffee shops and gyms, and they will naturally gather and run into each other. And so we're trying to make the park not only stickier from a real estate point of view, but we're also trying to make it more innovative and more interactive by using the power of real estate and placemaking to help drive innovation.
If anyone else has questions, go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, Aaron, it's Kurt Fassard, and just what are your thoughts with regard to a couple of other components and how they tie into Research Park? First would be mortgage, so the mortgage center, and then the second is the new computer and data sciences center.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really exciting things going on the campus right now. And, you mentioned a couple of them. Of course, mortgage is kind of a private arm that does research either that the university can't do or just outside the walls of the university. And in some cases plays roles in attracting or recruiting star researchers to Madison. So that's a big piece of infrastructure that got stood up in the last 15 years or so that's really important. And then recently, the university created the new School of Computer, Data, and Information Sciences. They're hopefully going to be launching a new building, which I think will be very exciting as a place to gather. There's a third initiative that a lot of people don't know about yet, but the university and Research Park are working together to launch a real estate initiative that will allow the park and the university in concert with each other to develop more space around campus in particular, or around the research park for non-university uses. And so we think there's a pretty big opportunity to bring more incubator space, more innovation space, corporate centers of excellence or research centers to campus so that they can be clustered up with students and faculty in a more proximate way. And so those things I think are all reinforcing of this idea. So much in the same way we're trying to make the research park more of an innovation district, the university is starting to think about how they can use infrastructure like the two you mentioned, combined with private sector development to really stimulate innovation activity on campus as well.
Aaron, I know several years ago, the research park was working on securing special Department of Defense security levels. I'm wondering if you might be able to share a little bit about kind of where that is right now, if that space is being utilized.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a sad story in some ways. There was a big effort to secure some federal funding to build what is called a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. A bunch of partners got together and they stood up a new nonprofit, which still exists, called the Wisconsin Security Research Consortium. And that group built the SCIF with a bunch of grant money. Sadly, it has never been used. So we still have this SCIF sitting at Research Park waiting for somebody who needs it and wants to activate it. And what it is basically is this is probably not the official terminology, but it's basically a bug-proof room that you can't eavesdrop on. It has no windows. It's like a windowless office, basically. And it's waiting for classified researchers who have classified research grants, or a company that's doing classified work, probably in the cybersecurity area is the most likely bet, to secure funding and come and use it. So it is available. It's there. There's a SCIF ready facility, but I'm kind of sad to say that no one's actually using it right now.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, very interesting presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's always fun to talk about the university and to give people a little bit of glimpse about what Research Park is up to. But for me, growing up in Middleton, and I can't believe I live in Middleton again, but I'm also a resident. 20-year-old me would never believe I'd be back, but I love it.
It happens.
So it's a special delight to be speaking to the Middleton Chamber.
Thank you, Aaron.
Well, we have to get together soon again, but I did want to say, in terms of your concept, bringing those people together, that's what AgriCities was based on. Just all various disciplines, and we beat the whole world. So just a small group of people. And I didn't really, that was the concept, has been tested. So I think your analysis is really very profound. I really didn't think about the population size and relationship to innovation. It does make sense, but I think the way you looked at these things was very, very interesting. So maybe you could make a shortened presentation to the city council, especially, the part, well, we will talk about it, but I think this was really great presentation, and I'm very impressed, and I can tell the Oxford did make a difference. It's not just those buildings there, and I know the Cambridge is maybe ahead now, but we won't talk about that now.
I think I'm going to interject before there's a fight that happens on Zoom today. I want to thank all of you guys for being here, and a special thank you to Aaron for presenting. We appreciate all of you guys spending time with us today. 2 quick plugs for upcoming events. So next week, Tuesday, Networking Blitz. So if you're looking to connect with other chamber members one-on-one, that's your chance. And then at the end of the month, we are doing a business boost. It's networking, it's your superpower. So one of the benefits of having virtual events is that we can get a national speaker in. So Kesha will be joining us from St. Louis, and she is all about networking and giving you great tips, virtual or in person. So we hope you guys can join us. Thanks for being here.
And in-person networking on October 5th.
Oh, and on October 5th, yes.